Detective Miller wasn't your typical hero. He wasn't tall, or particularly handsome, and his tie was always just a little bit crooked. He wasn't even particularly happy. A shadow hung over him, the unsolved murder of Mr. Abernathy, the baker. Mr. Abernathy made the best blueberry muffins in the city, and everyone loved him. It had been a year since that terrible day in the park, and the case was colder than a scoop of ice cream in December. Miller felt the weight of it every time he walked into the precinct. His captain, a gruff but fair man named Johnson, kept reminding him, "Miller, we need to close this one. For Mr. Abernathy, and for the city." Miller wanted to close it more than anything. He'd spent countless hours poring over evidence, interviewing witnesses, chasing dead ends. Nothing. The killer had vanished like smoke. The pressure was building, a knot in his stomach that wouldn't go away. He shuffled through the case files again, the photos of the park, the witness statements, the police reports. Each one a reminder of his failure. He knew he needed a fresh perspective, something he'd missed before. He just didn't know what. He sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. Maybe today would be the day. Maybe today, something would finally click. He had to believe that. The day Mr. Abernathy died had started like any other summer day in Harmony Park. Children shrieked with laughter as they chased pigeons, couples strolled hand in hand along the winding paths, and the sweet aroma of Mr. Abernathy's blueberry muffins wafted through the air from his usual spot near the fountain. Miller remembered arriving at the scene. The bright, cheerful atmosphere had been shattered. Yellow tape cordoned off the area around Mr. Abernathy's overturned cart. The air, once filled with the scent of muffins, now reeked of something acrid and metallic. Mr. Abernathy lay still, a splash of crimson staining the pristine white of his baker's apron. His eyes, usually twinkling with warmth, were now vacant and staring. The muffin baskets were scattered, their precious contents ruined, staining the ground blue. The park, usually a place of joy, had become a scene of unimaginable sadness. The laughter of children seemed to mock the tragedy. The pigeons, oblivious to the horror, pecked at the fallen muffins. It was a picture Miller would never forget, a vivid snapshot etched into his memory. He had promised himself, standing there amidst the chaos, that he would bring the person responsible to justice. He just hadn't figured out how yet. The memory fueled him, even a year later. Back in the present, Miller sat at his cluttered desk, the lamplight casting long shadows across the room. The Abernathy file was spread out before him like a roadmap to nowhere. He reread the witness statements, each one a frustratingly incomplete puzzle piece. Mrs. Gable had seen a shadowy figure running away, but couldn't describe him. Little Timmy had seen a bad man, but Timmy was 5 years old and also claimed to have seen a talking squirrel. Captain Johnson's words echoed in his head. "Miller, we've got nothing new. The public is losing faith. We need a break, something, anything." Miller knew Johnson was right. The pressure was immense. He felt like he was running in circles, chasing ghosts. He needed to find something, a thread, a detail, anything that would lead him out of this labyrinth. He started sorting the evidence again, separating photos from documents, organizing witness statements by time. It was a tedious process, but sometimes, buried beneath the layers of information, a glimmer of truth could be found. He picked up a stack of magazines recovered from a nearby trash can. They were mostly old news, celebrity gossip, and advertisements. He almost tossed them aside, but something made him pause. One of the magazines had a familiar cover. It was the July issue of Sunshine Style, the one with the sunglasses ad. It had been photographed in Harmony Park. On the day of the murder. The ad itself was simple, a smiling model wearing sleek, black sunglasses, posed against the backdrop of the park's fountain. The tagline read, "See the world in style." Miller almost dismissed it as irrelevant. Ads were ads. But something nagged at him. He remembered the crime scene photos. The park had been unusually crowded that day, and there were several commercial shoots happening. He pulled out the corresponding file. He compared the crime scene photos with the magazine ad. The fountain, the trees, the position of the sun, everything matched. It was definitely taken on the day of the murder, probably just hours before. He studied the ad more closely. The model's sunglasses reflected the surrounding environment. He could see blurry shapes of people, trees, and buildings. It was all just background noise, a jumble of indistinct forms. But then, his eyes landed on a small, dark patch within the reflection of one of the lenses. It was a blurry, almost imperceptible shape, but something about it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It was a distorted figure, standing near a tree, partially obscured by leaves. He couldn't make out any details, but the figure seemed to be watching the model, or perhaps, watching something else. Miller's heart began to race. Could this be it? Could this blurry reflection be the key to unlocking the mystery of Mr. Abernathy's murder? The blurry reflection seemed insignificant, a mere smudge on the polished surface of the sunglasses. Miller held the magazine up to the light, tilting it this way and that, trying to get a better look. It was frustratingly indistinct. It could be anything, a shadow, a trick of the light, a random passerby. He blinked, rubbing his eyes again. He'd been staring at this case for so long, maybe his mind was playing tricks on him. Maybe he was seeing what he wanted to see, a desperate attempt to find something, anything, to break the deadlock. He almost dismissed it, telling himself it was just a waste of time. But the nagging feeling persisted. That small, dark shape in the reflection. It felt wrong. It felt out of place. It felt like something hidden, something sinister. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a random blur. It was a potential witness, a silent observer, lurking in the background of a seemingly innocent advertisement. He knew he had to investigate further. He couldn't just ignore it. Even if it turned out to be nothing, he had to be sure. Mr. Abernathy deserved that much. He carefully placed the magazine on his desk, marking the page with a sticky note. He knew what he had to do next. He had to enhance the image. He had to see what was hidden within that blur. He had to find out who was standing in the shadows of Harmony Park on that fateful day. Miller knew the odds were stacked against him. Image enhancement was never as clear-cut as it looked in movies. Zoom and enhance rarely produced crystal-clear results. More often than not, it just amplified the blur, creating a pixelated mess. He'd seen countless cases where detectives had wasted hours trying to sharpen blurry images, only to end up with nothing but frustration. He pushed those doubts aside. He had to try. He couldn't live with the thought that he hadn't explored every possible avenue. He carefully removed the magazine page and walked down the hall to the forensics lab. The lab was a sterile, brightly lit space, filled with sophisticated equipment. He found Officer Riley, a young tech specialist with a knack for digital imaging, hunched over a computer screen. "Riley," Miller said, "I need your help with something." He showed Riley the magazine page and pointed to the blurry reflection in the sunglasses. "I need you to try and enhance this. See if you can make out any details." Riley took the page, examining it with a critical eye. "Detective, I don't know. This is pretty rough. The resolution is terrible." I know, Miller said, "but it's all I've got. Just do your best. See if you can pull anything out of it." He held his breath, hoping that Riley could work some kind of magic. This blurry reflection was a long shot, he knew, but it was the only shot he had. Riley spent the next hour hunched over the computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Miller watched anxiously, pacing back and forth, trying to contain his impatience. The screen flickered with a dizzying array of colors and patterns as Riley ran various algorithms, attempting to sharpen the image and reduce the noise. "It's pretty bad, Detective," Riley said, shaking his head. "I can enhance the pixels, but there's not much information to work with. It's mostly just a lot of digital artifacts." Miller leaned closer, peering at the screen. The blurry reflection was still blurry, but now it was also jagged and pixelated. It looked even less like a person than it had before. He felt a wave of disappointment wash over him. He'd allowed himself to get his hopes up, and now it seemed like it was all for nothing. "Try a different filter," Miller suggested, trying to mask his frustration. "Maybe something that reduces edge distortion." Riley nodded and tried another algorithm. The image shifted again, becoming slightly less pixelated, but still frustratingly indistinct. They tried several more techniques, each one yielding similar results. The blurry reflection remained a blurry reflection. Miller was about to give up. He was about to concede that it was just a waste of time. But then, Riley made a small adjustment, tweaking the contrast and brightness. And suddenly, something shifted. A faint outline began to emerge from the pixelated mess. A suggestion of a face, a hint of a shoulder, the curve of an arm. It was still blurry, still indistinct, but it was something. "Wait," Miller said, his voice catching in his throat. "Go back. What did you just do?" Riley slowly retraced his steps, reapplying the filter and tweaking the contrast and brightness levels. The faint outline solidified, becoming slightly more defined. It was still a long way from being a clear image, but it was enough to see the basic shape of a person. "Zoom in," Miller instructed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Zoom in on the face." Riley zoomed in, the pixels blurring and distorting the image further. It was like looking through a frosted window. But as Riley continued to adjust the settings, a few key features began to emerge. The angle of the jaw, the shape of the nose, the set of the eyes. They were all distorted and pixelated, but they were there. Miller stared at the screen, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt a flicker of recognition, a faint echo of a face he knew. He grabbed a file from his desk, flipping through mugshots, searching for a match. He scanned the faces, comparing them to the blurry image on the screen. Most of them were wrong, completely off the mark. But then, he saw one. A face that made his blood run cold. A face he knew all too well. He pointed at the screen. "Stop," he exclaimed. "Go back to the original enhancement. And compare it to this." He held up the mugshot, his hand trembling slightly. "Tell me what you see, Riley." The air in the lab crackled with tension. This blurry reflection, this long shot, was starting to look like something real. Something dangerous. Riley stared at the screen, then at the mugshot, then back at the screen. He adjusted the contrast again, sharpening the lines, clarifying the shadows. Slowly, painstakingly, the blurry image began to resolve itself. The pixelated mess transformed into something recognizable. I see it, Detective," Riley stammered, his eyes wide with disbelief. "The jawline, the nose, the eyes, it's him." The face on the screen, however distorted and pixelated, was undeniably Silas, the Shadow, Blackwood. Silas the Shadow. A career criminal with a rap sheet as long as Miller's arm. Known for his stealth, his violence, and his uncanny ability to disappear without a trace. He was a ghost, a whisper in the criminal underworld. Miller felt a surge of adrenaline. Silas the Shadow. He'd interviewed him once, years ago, during a robbery investigation. Silas had been slippery, evasive, but ultimately, they hadn't had enough evidence to hold him. Now, here he was, potentially linked to the Abernathy murder. "Run a facial recognition scan," Miller ordered, his voice tight with anticipation. "Confirm the match." Riley ran the scan. The computer whirred and clicked, comparing the enhanced image to the police database. A moment later, the screen flashed green. "Match confirmed," Riley announced. 98% probability. It's Silas Blackwood. 98%. It wasn't absolute certainty, but it was enough. It was more than enough. Miller had his suspect. After a year of dead ends and frustration, he finally had a name, a face, a connection to the murder of Mr. Abernathy. But he also knew this was just the beginning. He still had to prove it. He still had to find the evidence to put Silas the Shadow behind bars. And Silas the Shadow wasn't going to make it easy. Miller rushed back to his desk, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He pulled out the original Abernathy case file, flipping through the witness statements and police reports. He needed to find anything that connected Silas to the murder. And then he remembered. Silas had been questioned early in the investigation, but he'd had an alibi. A seemingly airtight alibi. He'd claimed to be out of town, visiting his sick mother in a neighboring state. He'd even provided a bus ticket and a signed affidavit from his mother. It had all checked out. At the time, they had no reason to doubt him. Miller found the relevant documents. The bus ticket was for a one-way trip to Oakhaven, leaving the day before the murder and returning several days later. The affidavit from Silas's mother confirmed his visit. It had seemed like an open-and-shut case. Silas couldn't have been in Harmony Park on the day of the murder. But now, with the blurry reflection in the sunglasses ad, everything had changed. The alibi, once solid, now seemed flimsy and suspicious. Could Silas have lied? Could he have faked the bus ticket and the affidavit? Could he have slipped back into town just long enough to commit the murder, then disappeared again? Miller knew he had to dig deeper. He had to verify Silas's alibi. He had to find out if Silas had been telling the truth, or if he'd been playing them all along. He picked up the phone and dialed Captain Johnson's office. "Captain," he said, his voice urgent, "I need to reopen the Abernathy case. I think I've got a suspect. Silas, the Shadow, Blackwood." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Miller could almost hear Johnson's skepticism. "And what makes you think that, Miller? We cleared him a year ago. He had an alibi." "I know, Captain," Miller said, "but I've got something new. Something that changes everything." He knew he had an uphill battle ahead of him, but he was ready to fight. He was finally on the right track. It took some convincing. Captain Johnson was a practical man, a stickler for procedure. He didn't like hunches or maybes. He liked facts, solid evidence, things he could take to the district attorney and get a conviction. A blurry reflection in a sunglasses ad didn't exactly fit that bill. "Miller, I appreciate your enthusiasm," Johnson said, leaning back in his chair, "but this is a long shot. A really long shot. We're talking about a blurry image, enhanced by a computer. It's not exactly rock-solid evidence." "I know, Captain," Miller said, "but it's enough to warrant a second look. Silas had an alibi, but what if it was a lie? What if he was in town that day? We owe it to Mr. Abernathy to explore every possibility." Miller presented the enhanced image, side by side with Silas's mugshot. He explained how the image had been enhanced, how Riley had confirmed the match. He laid out his theory, piece by piece, connecting the dots, showing how Silas could have slipped back into town, committed the murder, and then disappeared again, all while maintaining his alibi. Johnson listened patiently, his expression unreadable. When Miller finished, he sighed. "All right, Miller," he said, "I'll give you a week. A week to prove that Silas Blackwood was in Harmony Park on the day of the murder. If you can find something, anything, that corroborates this blurry image, I'll authorize a full investigation. But if you come up empty-handed, we drop it. Understood?" "Understood, Captain," Miller said, a surge of relief washing over him. He had a week. A week to prove that a blurry reflection could solve a year-old murder. A week to bring justice to Mr. Abernathy. The clock was ticking. The skepticism wasn't just coming from Captain Johnson. As word spread around the precinct that Miller was reopening the Abernathy case based on a blurry reflection in a sunglasses ad, whispers started. Some detectives chuckled, shaking their heads. Others were more direct, questioning Miller's judgment. "A blurry reflection, Miller? Seriously? Detective Davies said, leaning against Miller's desk. That's what you're hanging your hat on. We cleared that guy a year ago. I know, Davies, Miller said, trying to keep his voice even, but I've got a feeling about this. Something doesn't add up. A feeling? Feelings don't solve murders, Miller. Evidence does. And all you've got is a pixelated blob. Miller ignored the jabs as best he could. He knew his colleagues were just doing their jobs, being cautious, being skeptical. They'd seen too many cases go cold, too many wild goose chases. They didn't want to waste their time on another dead end. But Miller couldn't shake the feeling that he was on to something. He had a week to prove it, and he wasn't going to let the doubts of others deter him. He needed to focus, to stay disciplined, to follow every lead, no matter how small. He started by revisiting Silas's alibi. He pulled the bus ticket and the affidavit from the file. He needed to verify them, to confirm that Silas had actually been on that bus, that his mother had actually signed that affidavit. He knew it was a long shot, but it was the only shot he had. He grabbed his coat and headed out the door. I'm going to Oakhaven, he told Davies. I'm going to talk to Silas's mother. I'm going to find out if he was really out of town that day. Or if he was lying. He knew the truth was out there, somewhere. He just had to find it. The bus station in Oakhaven was a rundown building with peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights. Miller showed the bus ticket to the clerk, a bored-looking woman with tired eyes. Can you confirm that this ticket was used on July 15th of last year? He asked. The clerk examined the ticket. I can check, she said, tapping away at her computer. After a few minutes, she shook her head. I'm sorry, sir. The system only keeps records for 6 months. I can't verify anything from last year. Miller sighed. Another dead end. He decided to try a different approach. He asked the clerk if she remembered seeing Silas. He showed her a picture, but she didn't recognize him. We get a lot of people coming through here, she said. I can't remember everyone. Frustrated, Miller left the bus station and headed to Silas's mother's house. It was a small, dilapidated bungalow on the outskirts of town. He knocked on the door, and a frail, elderly woman answered. She had kind eyes and a weary smile. Mrs. Blackwood? Miller asked. I'm Detective Miller. I'm investigating a case, and I need to ask you a few questions about your son, Silas. Mrs. Blackwood invited him inside. The house was small and cluttered, filled with old furniture and faded photographs. Miller showed her the affidavit she had signed, confirming that Silas had visited her on July 15th of last year. Did Silas really visit you that day, Mrs. Blackwood? Miller asked gently. Mrs. Blackwood hesitated. She looked down at her hands, her brow furrowed. He came to see me, she said slowly. But, he wasn't here for very long. Just a few hours. He said he had to go back to the city. A few hours. That was all Silas would have needed. Miller felt a surge of hope. He pressed further. Did he say why he had to go back so quickly, Mrs. Blackwood? Mrs. Blackwood shook her head. He didn't say. He just said he had to go. I didn't ask too many questions. I was just happy to see him. Miller thanked Mrs. Blackwood for her time and left the house. He had his inconsistency. Silas hadn't stayed in Oakhaven for several days, as his alibi claimed. He'd only been there for a few hours. It wasn't proof, but it was a crack in Silas's seemingly airtight story. He had to find more. Back at the precinct, Miller was poring over the evidence again, a renewed sense of purpose driving him. Mrs. Blackwood's statement was a start, but he needed more. He needed something concrete to prove that Silas had been in Harmony Park on the day of the murder. He focused on the bus ticket. It was a flimsy piece of paper, easily forged. But what if there was another ticket? What if Silas had taken a different bus back to the city, one that he hadn't accounted for? He decided to check the records of the Harmony Park bus depot, the one closest to the crime scene. It was a long shot, but he had to try. He spent hours sifting through old manifests, searching for a bus that had arrived from Oakhaven on July 15th. The task was tedious and frustrating, but he refused to give up. Finally, after hours of searching, he found something. A bus had arrived from Oakhaven at 8 a.m. on July 15th. The manifest didn't list the passengers by name, but it did include ticket numbers. Miller compared the ticket numbers to the one Silas had provided as part of his alibi. They were different. He felt a jolt of excitement. This could be it. This could be the break he needed. He carefully examined the manifest, looking for any other clues. And then he saw it. A notation next to one of the ticket numbers, stub only. A stub-only ticket meant that the passenger had only purchased a one-way ticket and hadn't used the return portion. It meant that someone had traveled from Oakhaven to Harmony Park on the morning of the murder, and they hadn't bought a ticket to go back. Miller cross-referenced the ticket number with the bus company's database. It was registered to a S. Blackwood. It wasn't a full name, but it was enough. It was another piece of the puzzle, another crack in Silas's alibi. He had proof that Silas had been back in town on the day of the murder. Now he just needed to find a witness who could place him at the scene. The pressure was mounting, but Miller was closer than ever to solving the case. Miller knew he needed to find the bus driver who had driven the 8 a.m. bus from Oakhaven to Harmony Park on July 15th. He tracked down the bus company's personnel records and found the driver's name, Frank Peterson. Peterson was retired now, living in a small apartment on the other side of town. Miller paid him a visit, showing him a picture of Silas Blackwood. "Do you recognize this man, Mr. Peterson?" he asked. "Did you see him on your bus on July 15th of last year?" Peterson squinted at the picture, his brow furrowed in concentration. "That was a long time ago, Detective," he said. "I see a lot of faces. Hard to remember them all." Miller felt a familiar wave of frustration. He was so close, but he needed Peterson to remember. "Think hard, Mr. Peterson," he urged. "This is very important. This man may have been involved in a serious crime." Peterson studied the picture again, his eyes scanning Silas's face. After a long pause, he nodded slowly. I think I remember him," he said. "He was a quiet guy. Kept to himself. Sat in the back of the bus. Wore a dark hat. Didn't say much to anyone. It wasn't a definitive identification, but it was enough. It was another piece of the puzzle, another confirmation that Silas had been on that bus." "Are you sure, Mr. Peterson?" Miller asked. "Are you absolutely sure you saw him?" Peterson hesitated. "I can't be 100% certain, Detective," he said. "But yeah, I think it was him. There was something about his eyes. I remember his eyes." Miller thanked Peterson for his time and left the apartment. He had another piece of evidence, another reason to believe that Silas Blackwood was guilty. But he still needed more. He needed a witness who could place Silas at the scene of the murder. He needed someone who had seen Silas in Harmony Park on the day Mr. Abernathy died. He knew it was a long shot, but he had to try. He had to keep digging. The clock was ticking, and he was running out of time. Desperate for a witness, Miller decided to revisit Harmony Park, hoping to jog someone's memory. He showed the enhanced photo of Silas to anyone who would give him the time of day: dog walkers, elderly couples, teenagers hanging out near the fountain. Most people shook their heads, saying they didn't recognize him. He was about to give up when he saw an elderly woman sitting on a bench, feeding the pigeons. He recognized her as Mrs. Higgins, a park regular who had been interviewed during the initial investigation. She had claimed to have seen nothing of importance. Miller approached her cautiously, showing her the enhanced photo. "Mrs. Higgins," he said, "I know it's been a long time, but I need to ask you again. Do you recognize this man? Was he in the park on the day Mr. Abernathy died? Mrs. Higgins peered at the photo, her eyes squinting behind her thick glasses. She studied the blurry image for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Miller held his breath, waiting for her response. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. That man. She said, I think I saw him. Near the trees. Watching Mr. Abernathy. Miller's heart leaped. Are you sure, Mrs. Higgins? He asked, his voice trembling with excitement. Are you absolutely sure it was him? Mrs. Higgins nodded slowly. I remember his eyes, she said. They were cold. Like a snake. I was afraid of him. That's why I didn't say anything before. I didn't want him to hurt me. Miller had his witness. After a year of dead ends and frustration, he finally had someone who could place Silas Blackwood at the scene of the murder. It wasn't just a blurry reflection anymore. It was a real person, a credible witness, who had seen Silas in Harmony Park on the day Mr. Abernathy died. He had his proof. Now he just had to bring Silas in. And this time, he wasn't going to let him go. With Mrs. Higgins' testimony in hand, Miller felt he had enough to bring Silas in for questioning. But he wanted to be prepared. He wanted to know why Silas would want to kill Mr. Abernathy. He needed a motive. He decided to revisit the initial investigation, to look for anything he might have missed. He reread the witness statements, the police reports, the financial records. And then he found something. A small, almost insignificant note in the file. It mentioned that Mr. Abernathy had been having trouble with a local gang. The note indicated that the gang had been demanding protection money from Mr. Abernathy, and he had refused to pay. The gang was known for its violent tactics and its ties to organized crime. Silas the Shadow had been associated with the gang in the past. Miller felt a surge of understanding. It all made sense now. Silas hadn't just been a random observer in the park. He'd been there to enforce the gang's demands. He'd been there to silence Mr. Abernathy. He pulled up the gang's file, reviewing their known members and activities. He found several connections between Silas and the gang's leadership. It was clear that Silas was more than just an associate. He was a trusted enforcer, a reliable hitman. The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. Silas had a motive, he had a connection to the victim, and he had been at the scene of the crime. Miller had enough evidence to bring him in, to question him, to break his alibi and expose him for the killer he was. He contacted Captain Johnson, requesting a warrant for Silas Blackwood's arrest. I've got him, Captain, Miller said, his voice filled with determination. I know who killed Mr. Abernathy. It was Silas the Shadow. And this time, he's not going to get away. The protection racket was a simple but brutal scheme. The gang would approach local businesses, demanding a weekly or monthly fee. In exchange, the gang would protect the business from vandalism, theft, and other forms of harassment. If the business owner refused to pay, the gang would make their lives miserable, damaging their property, threatening their employees, and even resorting to violence. Mr. Abernathy had been a proud and principled man. He believed in honest work and fair play. He refused to be intimidated by the gang's threats. He refused to pay them a single penny. The gang didn't take kindly to his defiance. They sent Silas the Shadow to send him a message. A message that he couldn't ignore. A message that would ensure he paid up. But Mr. Abernathy still refused. He stood his ground, even in the face of Silas's intimidation. He was a pillar of the community, a beloved figure, and he wouldn't let a bunch of thugs push him around. Silas, known for his ruthlessness and his loyalty to the gang, took matters into his own hands. He silenced Mr. Abernathy permanently. He sent a message to all the other businesses in the park, pay up, or face the consequences. Miller knew that Silas had been acting on orders, that he was just a pawn in a larger game. But that didn't excuse his actions. He had taken a life, and he had to pay for it. Miller was determined to bring him to justice, to hold him accountable for his crimes. He had a warrant, a witness, and a motive. He had everything he needed. He just had to find Silas and bring him in. And he knew that Silas the Shadow wouldn't be waiting for him. He would be running, hiding, trying to disappear once again. But Miller was ready. He was prepared. He was going to hunt him down, and he wasn't going to stop until he had him in custody. Miller knew that the evidence against Silas was strong, but it was still largely circumstantial. He had the blurry reflection, the bus ticket, Mrs. Higgins' testimony, and the connection to the gang. But he didn't have any direct evidence, no murder weapon, no fingerprints, no confession. He needed something more, something that would erase any doubt, something that would convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. He needed to find something that tied Silas directly to the murder, something that couldn't be explained away. He decided to revisit the crime scene one last time, to walk in Silas's footsteps, to try to see the park through his eyes. He spent hours wandering around Harmony Park, retracing Mr. Abernathy's movements, imagining Silas lurking in the shadows. He examined the area around Mr. Abernathy's cart, looking for anything that might have been overlooked. He searched the bushes, the trees, the trash cans. He found nothing. He was about to give up when he noticed something glinting in the sunlight. It was a small, metal object, half buried in the dirt near a tree. He picked it up and examined it closely. It was a button. A small, black button, the kind that might be found on a coat or a jacket. It didn't seem like much, but something about it caught Miller's attention. He remembered reading in the police report that Mr. Abernathy had struggled with his attacker. What if this button had been torn off Silas's coat during the struggle? He carefully bagged the button and took it back to the lab. He asked Riley to examine it, to see if it could be linked to Silas. He knew it was a long shot, but it was worth a try. He needed that one piece of evidence, that one irrefutable link, that would seal Silas's fate. He had a feeling that this button might be it. Silas was brought in late that afternoon. He was calm, almost unnervingly so. He sat across from Miller in the interrogation room, his eyes cold and calculating. He denied everything. "I don't know what you're talking about, detective," he said, his voice smooth and even. "I was out of town on the day Mr. Abernathy died. I have an alibi." Miller laid out the evidence, piece by piece. The blurry reflection, the bus ticket, Mrs. Higgins' testimony, the connection to the gang. Silas listened patiently, his expression never changing. "Circumstantial," he said dismissively. "All of it. You have nothing concrete. No murder weapon, no fingerprints, no witnesses who can positively identify me." Miller knew he was right. The evidence was strong, but it wasn't airtight. He needed something more. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, black button. "We found this near the scene of the crime, Silas," he said. "Do you recognize it?" Silas glanced at the button, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Never seen it before," he said. "Probably just some trash someone dropped." Miller leaned forward, his eyes locking with Silas's. "Maybe," he said. "But maybe it's the button that was torn off your coat when you were struggling with Mr. Abernathy. Maybe it's the button that will send you to prison for the rest of your life." He watched Silas closely, looking for any sign of weakness, any flicker of guilt. But Silas remained impassive. He was a master of deception, a seasoned criminal who knew how to play the game. Miller knew he had to try something different. He had to find a way to break through Silas's cool exterior, to crack his composure and expose the truth. He had to find a way to make him confess. But how? Silas wasn't going to make it easy. He was the Shadow, and he knew how to stay hidden. Miller leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on Silas. He had one more card to play. He signaled to Officer Riley, who entered the interrogation room carrying a small, velvet box. Riley placed the box on the table in front of Silas. "What's this?" Silas asked, his voice still calm, but with a hint of curiosity. Miller smiled. "Open it and find out," he said. Silas hesitated for a moment, then reached out and opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a pair of sleek, black sunglasses. The same sunglasses that had been advertised in the magazine, the same sunglasses that had captured Silas's blurry reflection. Silas stared at the sunglasses, his expression unreadable. He picked them up, turning them over in his hands. "What am I supposed to do with these?" he asked. "Try them on," Miller said. Silas hesitated again, then shrugged and put on the sunglasses. He looked at Miller, his eyes hidden behind the dark lenses. "So what?" he asked. "They're just sunglasses." "Are they, Silas?" Miller said, his voice low and menacing. "Or are they a reminder of the day you killed Mr. Abernathy? A reminder of the day you thought you could get away with murder?" He watched Silas closely, looking for any reaction, any flicker of recognition. And then he saw it. A subtle, almost imperceptible twitch in Silas's jaw. A fleeting expression of fear in his eyes. It was barely there, but it was enough. Miller knew he had struck a nerve. The sunglasses had triggered something, a memory, a feeling, something that Silas couldn't control. He was finally getting to him. The shadow was starting to crack. Miller pressed his advantage. He knew he had to keep the pressure on Silas, to exploit that moment of weakness. He leaned closer, his voice low and intense. "You remember that day, don't you, Silas?" he said. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and Mr. Abernathy was selling his blueberry muffins. It was a beautiful day. A perfect day, to commit murder. Silas didn't respond. He just sat there, his eyes hidden behind the sunglasses, his face a mask of indifference. But Miller could see the tension in his body, the subtle clenching of his fists. He knew he was getting to him. "You thought you were so clever, didn't you, Silas?" Miller continued. "You thought you could slip in and out of town, commit the murder, and then disappear without a trace. You thought you could fool everyone with your alibi. But you made a mistake, Silas. You forgot about the sunglasses." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Those sunglasses captured your reflection, Silas. They captured your guilt. They're the reason you're sitting here right now. They're the reason you're going to prison." He stood up and walked around the table, standing directly behind Silas. He reached out and gently removed the sunglasses from Silas's face. Silas didn't resist. He just sat there, his eyes wide and vacant, his composure finally shattered. Miller held the sunglasses in his hand, turning them over and over. "These sunglasses saw everything, Silas," he said. "They saw you kill Mr. Abernathy. And now, they're going to help me put you away." He placed the sunglasses back in the velvet box and closed the lid. The box sat on the table, a silent testament to Silas's guilt. Miller knew he was close. He could feel it. He just had to push a little harder, to ask the right questions, to say the right words, to finally break Silas and get him to confess. The shadow was about to be exposed. Miller sat back down, his eyes never leaving Silas. He knew he had to keep the pressure on, to keep chipping away at his defenses. He started to systematically dismantle Silas's alibi, highlighting the inconsistencies, exposing the lies. "You said you were in Oakhaven visiting your sick mother," Miller said. "But your mother said you were only there for a few hours. Why did you lie about that, Silas? What were you doing for the rest of the day?" Silas remained silent. "You said you took the bus to Oakhaven and back," Miller continued. "But we found a bus ticket stub registered to S. Blackwood on a bus that arrived in Harmony Park that morning. A one-way ticket. Why didn't you tell us about that bus, Silas?" Where were you going? Silas shifted in his chair, his eyes darting around the room. Mrs. Higgins saw you in the park that day, Silas, Miller said. She saw you watching Mr. Abernathy. She was afraid of you. Why were you watching him, Silas? What were you planning to do? Silas finally spoke, his voice low and strained. She's lying, he said. She didn't see me. I wasn't there. She saw your eyes, Silas, Miller said. She remembers your eyes. Cold. Like a snake. That's not something people forget. He paused, letting the words sink in. You went to Harmony Park to send a message, didn't you, Silas, he said. The gang told you to scare Mr. Abernathy, to make him pay up. But he refused, didn't he? He stood up to you. And you couldn't handle that, could you? You had to silence him. You had to show everyone who was in charge. Miller stood up again, walking around the table, invading Silas's space. You're a killer, Silas, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You're a cold-blooded murderer. And it's time you paid for your crimes. He watched Silas closely, waiting for him to crack, waiting for him to confess. The pressure was mounting. The inconsistencies were piling up. Silas was trapped, cornered, with no way out. He was about to break. Miller could feel it. The shadow was about to be consumed by the light. Silas sat in silence for a long moment, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped. The fight had gone out of him. The shadow had finally been defeated. He looked up at Miller, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. All right, he said, his voice barely a whisper. All right, I did it. Miller felt a surge of triumph. He had done it. He had broken Silas, he had gotten a confession. After a year of frustration and doubt, he had finally solved the Abernathy murder. Tell me what happened, Silas, Miller said, his voice calm and controlled. Tell me everything. Silas began to speak, his words tumbling out in a rush. He described how the gang had ordered him to scare Mr. Abernathy, how Mr. Abernathy had refused to pay, how he had lost his temper and attacked him. He described the struggle, the blood, the fear. He described how he had fled the park, leaving Mr. Abernathy to die. He confessed to everything, admitting his guilt, accepting his fate. He knew he was going to prison, and he knew he deserved it. Miller listened patiently, recording every word, documenting every detail. He had his confession, he had his proof. He had everything he needed to put Silas away for good. He contacted Captain Johnson, informing him of the confession. Johnson arrived at the interrogation room a few minutes later, his face grim but relieved. Good work, Miller, he said. You finally got him. Silas was taken into custody, booked, and charged with the murder of Mr. Abernathy. He was finally going to face justice for his crimes. The shadow had been brought into the light. And Harmony Park could finally begin to heal. The trial was swift and decisive. The evidence against Silas was overwhelming. The blurry reflection, the bus ticket, Mrs. Higgins' testimony, the button, and Silas's own confession all pointed to one inescapable conclusion: he was guilty. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Silas was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. He would spend the rest of his days behind bars, paying for his crime. The news of Silas's conviction spread quickly through Harmony Park. The community rejoiced, celebrating the fact that justice had finally been served. Mr. Abernathy's family was relieved, finally able to find some peace after a year of grief and uncertainty. A memorial was held in Harmony Park, honoring Mr. Abernathy's life and legacy. The park was filled with people, all remembering his kindness, his generosity, and his delicious blueberry muffins. A new baker took over Mr. Abernathy's spot near the fountain, selling his own version of the famous muffins. The aroma of freshly baked goods once again filled the air, bringing a sense of normalcy and joy back to the park. Harmony Park began to heal. The shadow that had hung over the community for so long finally began to lift. The laughter of children once again echoed through the trees, the couple strolled hand in hand along the winding paths, and the pigeons pecked at the crumbs beneath the benches. Life in Harmony Park returned to normal. Or as normal as it could be, after such a terrible tragedy. But the memory of Mr. Abernathy would never be forgotten. He would always be remembered as a symbol of kindness, generosity, and the enduring spirit of the community. And Silas the Shadow would always be remembered as the man who tried to take that away. But ultimately failed. Justice had been served. Back in his office, Miller sat at his desk, the Abernathy case file finally closed. The lamplight cast a warm glow on the room, chasing away the shadows that had haunted him for so long. He looked at his reflection in the window, seeing a different man than the one who had stared back a year ago. The weariness was still there, etched into the lines around his eyes, but there was something else too. A sense of peace, a sense of accomplishment, a sense of closure. He had solved the case that had consumed him, he had brought justice to Mr. Abernathy, and he had finally laid his ghosts to rest. He thought about the blurry reflection in the sunglasses ad, the seemingly insignificant detail that had unlocked the entire mystery. He realized that even the smallest things can matter, that even the most fleeting glimpses can reveal the truth. He had learned a valuable lesson, a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his career. He straightened his tie, the one that was always just a little bit crooked. He smiled, a genuine smile, the first one he had felt in a long time. He was still Detective Miller, the dedicated but weary detective. But he was also something more. He was a man who had overcome adversity, a man who had never given up, a man who had finally found his peace. He stood up.